Your Excellency, dear friends, buonasera a tutti, bruchim abaim. A very cordial welcome to all of you here tonight at the Pontifical Gregorian University for the 16th annual Brenninkmeijer-Werhahn lecture delivered by Professor Michael Segal of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the title of the conference is Daniel's Throne and its Earliest Jewish and Christian Readings. I am Father Philipp Gabriel Rentges, Director of the University's Cardinal Beer Center for Judaic Studies, and I'm particularly happy to be able to greet tonight Dr. Bruria Biton-Ashkeloni, Director of the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University, our sister organization, I may call it that way, which is in constant cooperation with us also in organizing tonight's event. This year's lecture falls on November 9th, date of the Kristallnacht, the pogrom against Jews throughout all Nazi Germany carried out in the night from November 9th to November 10th in 1938. In the course of this pogrom, about 1,400 synagogues and several thousand shops, apartments, and cemeteries were destroyed. Approximately 400 people murdered or driven to suicide. Starting with November 10th of the same year, 1938, 30,000 Jews were arrested and incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps. I would like to ask you to join me now in a moment of prayer, a prayer formulated by the late Bishop Klaus Hemmerle of Aix-la-Chapelle in commemoration of Kristallnacht. It certainly is a prayer drawn up first and foremost by a German for Germans, but it reaches out to express a lamentation of all persecution and violence against Jews. And as the Concilia Declaration Nostra Aetate states, I quote, "The Church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries all displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone." I suggest, therefore, that we now all recite together this prayer that you find here above or on a handout. Please feel free to use the English or the Italian version, whichever language you feel more comfortable in. Kristallnacht. The house of my God was set aflame, and mine own have done it. It was taken away from those who gave me the name of my God, and mine own have done it. They were set out of their own homes, and mine own have done it. They were deprived of all their belongings, their honor, and their good names, and mine own have done it. Their lives were taken away, and mine own have done it. They who pray to the name of the same God have kept silent on all this. Yes, mine own have done it. Some say, let's forget about it and put an end to it. But what has been forgotten returns, unexpectedly and unrecognized. How can we put an end to what we forget? Should I say, mine own did it, not me? No, mine own did it. What shall I say? My God, have mercy on me. What shall I say? Preserve in me thy name. Preserve in me their names. Preserve in me their memories. Preserve in me my shame. My God, have mercy on me. Thank you very much. At the beginning of the academic part of this lecture, I would like to give the floor to Father Nuno da Silva Gonçalves, the rector of this university.
Eccellenze, signori ambasciatori, cari professori e studenti, signore e signori, ho accettato molto volentieri l'invito del padre Philip Renches a rivolgervi un breve saluto all'inizio della conferenza di oggi. Lo faccio sicuramente per salutare anche il professor Michael Segal e tutti i presenti, ma anche per riaffermare l'importanza del Centro Cardinal Bea per gli studi giudaici all'interno della Pontificia Università Gregoriana. Il Centro Cardinal Bea ha un ruolo di primo piano nelle attività didattiche e di ricerca della nostra università, proprio perché ci avvicina al mondo ebraico e promuove la conoscenza reciproca tra ebrei e cristiani. Sicuramente ho presente oggi, in questo contesto, la dichiarazione Nostra Aetate del Concilio Vaticano II, fondamento solenne del dialogo tra ebrei e cristiani. Ma ho anche presente le visite storiche alla Sinagoga di Roma degli ultimi 3 papi, Giovanni Paolo II nel 1986, Benedetto XVI nel 2010 e Papa Francesco il 17 gennaio del 2016. San Giovanni Paolo II, nella visita alla Sinagoga di Roma, ci ha insegnato a chiamare i fratelli ebrei i nostri fratelli maggiori. Benedetto XVI, nella sua visita, si è riferito al Decalogo come tesoro comune che ebrei e cristiani possono offrire a tutta l'umanità e ha ribadito l'importanza del patrimonio spirituale che condividiamo. Papa Francesco, a sua volta, nella stessa linea dei suoi 2 immediati predecessori, ci ha ricordato nella sua visita alla Sinagoga di Roma che i cristiani, per comprendere se stessi, non possono non fare riferimento alle radici ebraiche. Sono sicuro che il Centro Cardinal Bea continuerà a impegnarsi nella conoscenza reciproca tra ebrei e cristiani e a far conoscere ai cristiani le proprie radici ebraiche. Questo è sicuramente un cammino di approfondimento della propria identità e comprensione di se stessi. Ringrazio tutti i presenti e in modo particolare la signora Aldegonde Brenninkmeijer, che insieme a suo marito Hubert Brenninkmeijer, al quale vanno anche i nostri cordiali saluti, ci aiuta a rendere possibili le iniziative di scambio e di cooperazione del Centro Cardinal Bea con il Centro per gli Studi del Cristianesimo dell'Università Ebraica di Gerusalemme. Grazie a tutti voi.
Thank you very much, Father Rector. And it is now my great privilege to present to you tonight's distinguished speaker, Professor Michael Segal. Michael Segal is the Father Takei Otsuki Professor of Biblical Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also serves as head of the Mandel Institute of Jewish Studies and editor of the Hebrew University Bible Project. Of his publications, I would like to mention here the Book of Jubilees, Rewritten Bible Redaction, Ideology and Theology, published in 2008, and Dreams, Riddles and Visions, Textual, Contextual and Intertextual Approaches to the Book of Daniel, published this year, 2016, apart from numerous academic articles and multiple volumes edited by Professor Segal. Professor Segal is also father of 4 boys in the age range between 9, the youngest, true, and 21. Correct. The way he manages to bring this all together in one single life is cause of my profound admiration. And we are very grateful that you found time to be with us here in Rome this week, including the panel that took place yesterday, the international panel at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, the Hebrew Bible in the Making. Michael Segal will speak for around 50 minutes to an hour, giving us about 15 minutes for questions after his lecture. Dear friends, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Segal.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. There's a handout that was given at the entrance, and it's important to have the handout because we're going to read texts. So if you don't have I don't know if there's a way to pass out handouts if people do not receive it, but I think it's important if you don't have one. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I want to start by expressing my appreciation for the invitation to speak here in the framework of the annual Brenninkmeijer-Werhahn lecture. The importance of this event, both in Rome and in Jerusalem, for the furthering of both academic cooperation and interreligious dialogue, cannot be overstated. I am honored to be the speaker this year. The title of my talk promises to investigate the apocalyptic vision in Daniel 7 and its subsequent interpretations in early Jewish and Christian sources. Due both to time constraints and to my fields of expertise, I will focus more on the biblical and early Jewish sources, and I will touch only briefly on the Christian sources at the end, although I'll give a little bit of a picture about how I see the origins of those Christian sources. Daniel 7 functions as a pivotal episode within the book of Daniel as a whole, completing the section of Aramaic court tales in chapters 2 to 7, while also constituting the first of 4 apocalyptic visions in chapters 7 to 12. This chapter presents perhaps the most complex interpretive issues of all the chapters in the book for both determining the theological worldview of its author and unlocking the cultural and literary background of this text. Previous studies have correctly drawn attention to the extra-biblical parallels to this vision. Tonight, however, I would like to highlight the inner-biblical interpretive elements of Daniel 7, an aspect of this chapter which I suggest has not yet received sufficient attention, and which will become crucial for understanding the theologically brazen picture that it portrays in subsequent readings of this apocalypse. Daniel 7, and I've given you part of it in Aramaic and in English, in source 1, presents a double apocalyptic vision. Double in the sense that in addition to the general dichotomy between the symmetric heavenly and earthly realms, 2 planes of activity may be identified within the heavenly mythic realm itself, verses 1 to 14. On one plane is the scene of the 4 beasts which arise from the great sea, and on the other is the divine court where these beasts are judged and punished, and where sovereignty is given to one, and here I'll say first in Aramaic, Kivar Enash. One of the central exegetical issues in the interpretation of Daniel 7 is the identification of the character in the vision described as Bar Enash. This Aramaic expression has been translated literally, and you'll find frequently in English translations, as one like the Son of Man. But the Aramaic Bar Enash, as people have pointed out, is equivalent to the Hebrew Ben Adam, and therefore a more appropriate translation is one like a man, which is common in books such as Ezekiel, where you have Ben Adam over and over again, meaning a human being. In the vision of the 4 beasts, the character that appears as a man reflects a being of higher standing than the other animals. Within Daniel, the heavenly interpreters of the apocalypses are also described as men in chapters 8, 9, 10, and 12. Now, what are the characteristics of this one like a man, Kivar Enash, which assist in identifying him within the context of the heavenly vision? According to verse 13, one like a human being came with the clouds of heaven. Interestingly, this picture appears in a number of instances in the Bible, all in reference to the Lord himself. And here these are sources 2a and 2b, Psalm 68:5. Sing to God, chant hymns to his name, Extol him who rides the clouds. Adonai is his name, exult in his presence. And similarly in Psalm 104:3, he, referring to God, makes the clouds his chariot. He moves on the wings of the wind. This biblical motif was almost certainly borrowed from a Canaanite context, in which the same image was attributed to Baal. Baal was referred to as Rochev Aravot, or Rochev Arafot, cloud rider, in the following passage, which is in source 3, whose significance for the comparative study of Daniel 7 has been noted previously. And this is a Ugaritic text from the Baal cycle. I'll read the English. Indeed, I tell you, Prince Baal, I reiterate, O cloud rider, now your enemy Baal, now smash your enemy. Next page. Now vanquish your foe, and here's significance. So assume your eternal kingship, your everlasting dominion. Okay, Baal, the cloud rider, receives everlasting kingship and dominion. The speaker in this passage is the craftsman Kotar Wahasis, who is encouraging Baal in his battle against Yam, the god of the sea. The context of this battle is the struggle between the gods for kingship over the world, which is precisely the primary topic of Daniel 7. A second parallel to this passage, a second parallel passage to Daniel 7 is also significant for the identification of one like the man. As I said, Baal is the recipient of eternal kingship and everlasting dominion. And this is almost identical to what the one like a man, Bar Enash, receives in Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, which you can read in source 1. Dominion, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples and nations of every language must serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship one that shall not be destroyed. Who receives eternal dominion and kingship elsewhere in the book of Daniel? Interestingly, the language and content of chapter 7, verse 14, the verse that I just read, parallels and overlaps that found in the doxologies in the narrative half of the book. And here, if you look at the chart I give you on page 2, source 4, you can see that in 5 columns, chapter 7, verse 14, for a moment we'll skip over chapter 7, verse 27, but you can see chapter 3, verse 31 to 33, chapter 4, verse 31, and chapter 6. These are the doxologies that appear at the end of each of the stories in Daniel, and I've used different underlining and putting in boxes to show you that the language is identical in all of these passages. It's even more identical in Aramaic, but they kept the language in the English translation as well. The phrases common to these passages, such as his dominion is an everlasting dominion, chapter 7, 14, and 431, or all peoples and nations of every language, which appears in 7:14 and 3:31 and 6:26. Or his kingship, one that shall not be destroyed, which is in 7:14 and 6:27, demonstrate that all of these passages are interdependent with each other. This shared language could be the result of the activity of a single author in all 3 spots, or 4 spots, but more likely stems from a conscious attempt to draw a connection between chapter 7 and these earlier passages in the book. In either case, these literary allusions point toward the identification of the one like a man in the vision of Daniel 7, who receives eternal dominion, with the subject of the doxologies in the previous chapters. Each figure possesses or receives an eternal kingdom and dominion over all of the nations of the world. The reuse of the language of the earlier chapters in relation to this figure, in addition to the use of the cloud writing motif, and this is going to be the central argument here in the first half of the paper, prompts a theologically radical suggestion. The author of this vision intended for one like a man to be identified with, and I wrote the Lord, but I realize now that's ambiguous, is identified with the God of Israel himself. In other words, the God of Israel who is parallel to the Baal figure in those passages, and God of Israel who is in 3:31, 4:31, and 6:27 has eternal dominion in the doxologies. I suggest that it is the God of Israel who is the character presented by Bar Enash. Okay, that's the radical suggestion. If you don't feel it's radical, then I guess that's good, but we'll continue the argument. Okay, let us now consider the verse that ends the entire vision, and this is chapter 7, verse 27, which is on the handout in the second column in verse 4. The kingship and dominion and grandeur belong to all the kingdoms under heaven, will be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High, La'am Kadishe Elyonin. This kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. This verse uses language that closely parallels verse 14. And here, for people who read Aramaic, I show you on the top of page 3 how the phrases of 7:14 and 7:27 can be aligned. You can see that 7:14 and 7:27 are clearly supposed to be read in parallel with each other. Despite the differences between the verses, their common basis is very apparent and allows us to read verse 27 as a word-for-word interpretation of verse 14. Verse 14 describes the details of the vision in the heavenly realm, while verse 27 provides the earthly counterpart, the people of Kadishei Elyonin, to various elements in this vision. Now, just for a moment, let us briefly consider the expression Kadishei Elyonin. And here I'm going to skip over most of my argument because it won't fit in the time. This expression appears in 3 additional verses in chapter 7, all in the section that presents the interpretation of the vision. And here I gave you 2 of the things in the excerpt that I gave you from chapter 7 in source number 1. So for example, in verse 18, then Kadishei Elyonin will receive the kingdom, and he will inherit the kingdom forever and ever. And in verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was rendered in favor of Kadishei Elyonin. For the time had come, and the holy ones, Kadishin, inherited the kingdom. And it appears one more time in verse 25. The context of all of these passages is the transition from the reign of the 4 kingdoms to the subsequent bestowal of dominion upon Kadishei Elyonin. Now, the identification of Am Kadishei Elyonin in verse 27 with Bar Enash in the vision, in other words, in the parallel, Am Kadishei Elyonin is parallel to Bar Enash in the vision, they both receive dominion, is mediated by the occurrence of Kadishei Elyonin in these 3 verses, in verses 18, 22, and 25. Now, to whom does Kadishei Elyonin refer? Much ink has been spilled over precisely this question among the many interpretive issues in this chapter. Most commentators, already starting with Septuagint, render the Aramaic expression Kadishei Elyonin as the holy ones of the Most High, Kadishei Elyonin. Now, it's a little bit difficult. Most people don't think about it, but this is not a classic form of a construct, Kadishei Elyonin. Especially because Elyonin is in plural, and how is the plural the Most High? Alternatively, based upon a linguistic analysis of the expression, I have proposed in the book that was published recently that the phrase may be translated as the Most High Holy Ones, or the Most High Holy One. In other words, the plural here is the plural majestatis, the majestic plural, which is what most people assume anyway for Elyonin. Identified as the God of Israel himself, who stands out among the various heavenly characters in Daniel 7. The correspondence of the one like a man in the vision to Kadishei Elyonin in the interpretation would on this reading be eminently plausible. Both refer to the God of Israel, who is to receive eternal dominion and sovereignty. The extended phrase, Am Kadishei Elyonin, the people of Kadishei Elyonin, would then refer to his nation, a reference to the people of Israel, who will benefit in the earthly realm from his dominion in the heavenly plane. Now, verses 18 and 22, which I already mentioned, those are the 2 verses that include Kadishei Elyonin, both use hafel forms of the Aramaic verb chasan, chet samech nun, which govern, we'll talk about what it means in a second, which governs the object dominion. As noted already by lexicographers and commentators, this Aramaic root has 2 distinct meanings, either strength or to inherit. The latter meaning related to inheritance, especially in the hafel conjugation, or the hafel conjugation in Biblical Aramaic, is attested in most Jewish dialects of Aramaic, as well as in Samaritan and Egyptian Aramaic. Since Daniel 7's interpretation of the vision treats the rise and fall of empires and who is to receive the kingdom, it is much more likely that it is the second meaning, to inherit, that is the one attested here. And this suggestion is further bolstered by the structure of verse 18, in which v'yachsinun, and they will, what I say inherit, is parallel to v'kablun, and they will receive. Now, it is significant that this same Aramaic root serves as a frequent stereotypical equivalent of a different Hebrew verb, nachal, which means to inherit, as well as achaz, or yarash, all with the semantic range of inherit, in the Aramaic Targumim. If you take all of the Aramaic Targumim, and you can do this very easily now by computer, and you search Hassan, you see it repeatedly translates words having to do with inherit. I suggest that the use of this root here within the context of Daniel 7 is part of an intentional effort by the author of this apocalypse to reuse the language of two other biblical passages. And this is the inner biblical interpretation that I suggested already in the introduction. Reuse of the Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, and Psalm 82, texts that greatly interested and influenced many writers in antiquity, and which also exhibit a distinct Canaanite imprint. Let us examine the language of the passage from Deuteronomy 32. And here I'm going to read, it's in source number 6. It's a very interesting case because the reading in the Masoretic text is different than what we have in the Septuagint and in Qumran, in 4Q Deuteronomy J, in one of the scrolls from K4. And then I'm going to read it according to the translation, according to the text of Qumran and the Septuagint, which is almost certainly the original. When the Most High gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to the number of, and in the Masoretic text it says Israelites, but the original text probably read, he fixed the boundaries according to the number of sons of God, B'nai Elohim, or divine beings. For the Lord, and here the Lord is a translation of the Tetragrammaton. In other words, the God of Israel's portion is his people, Jacob is his own allotment. These verses present a unique theological, cosmological view of the origins of the division of the world into nations and peoples. According to this perspective, this allotment was not by chance or due to historical developments, but rather the result of a primordial process in which each son of God was assigned a nation and a plot of land. The theological picture here is of a head deity, Elyon, the Most High, with other subordinate lesser divine figures, the B'nai Elohim. Now, scholars have debated the position of the God of Israel within this theological scheme, suggesting either that he is one of the B'nai Elohim, or alternatively that he himself should be identified as Elyon, the Most High. According to the first possibility, that he's one of the B'nai Elohim, which I will label the mythic option, when the supreme deity Elyon originally distributed the lands and peoples amongst the lesser divine beings, the God of Israel, as one of these second-tier deities, received Israel as his inheritance. According to the second possibility, which I'll call the demythologized option, when the God of Israel, designated as Elyon, distributed the lands and peoples, he decided to keep Israel to himself as his own personal possession. These two options offer significantly different perspectives on the role of God of Israel in the universe, and a potential distinction can be and has been made between the myth in its original form and its inclusion within the context of Deuteronomy 32. Now, how do these verses, which were addressed and interpreted in numerous ancient sources, relate to Daniel 7? Both Deuteronomy 32 and Daniel 7 describe a theological, cosmological picture with a leading divine entity and subordinate divine beings. In Deuteronomy 32, we find Elyon, the Most High, and the B'nai Elohim. While in Daniel 7, we find Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days, and Bar Enash, the one like a man, alongside the four other creatures. Most significantly, the context of each of these passages is the inheritance of the nations and lands by the subordinate divinities. Deuteronomy 32 describes the dawn of history, at which time the division of all the lands took place. And at that time, the God of Israel and Israel were paired together. Daniel 7 describes a process in which the four beasts, each of which apparently serves as the heavenly representative of one of the nations, emerge one after another from the great sea. This is generally interpreted to refer to four successive kingdoms, to eventually be succeeded by a fifth, eternal kingdom. However, it seems that the apocalypse does not simply envision a succession of 5 kingdoms. According to chapter 7, verse 11, the fourth beast was killed and its body was destroyed and consigned to flames. At the same time, the dominion of the other beasts was taken away, but they were given an unspecified extension of life. This implies that these kingdoms coexisted until the end of the kingdom represented by the fourth beast. And in fact, as the text emphasized, they will continue to persist even after the fourth kingdom has been destroyed. Thus, while Deuteronomy 32 focuses on the process of distribution of peoples and lands at the Ord site at the time of creation, Daniel 7 focuses on the end site, at which time the lands are to be reappropriated from all of these divine beings and redistributed to the god, to Am Kadishe Elyonin. Unlike the previous distribution, however, in the eschatological age, the land will be granted to only one divine character, the one like a man, or Kadishe Elyonin. In Deuteronomy 32, the God of Israel received only a small yet significant portion of the nations and lands of the world under his direct care. However, Daniel 7 envisions a transformation of the world order in which he will be sovereign over all the nations of the world, thus transforming the national God of Israel into a universal God to whom all nations will be subservient. Daniel 7 is not intended to replace Deuteronomy 32, since they describe different periods in the history of the world. The first describes the creation of the cosmos, while the second reaches toward a new creation of the theological and cosmological world order. Another potential interbiblical source for the notion of the appropriation of the lands from their members of the divine heavenly retinue and their grant to the God of Israel can be identified in Psalm 82, which is source number 7. I've given you the first 2 verses and the last 3 verses. This somewhat enigmatic psalm describes a heavenly scene in which one deity accuses others in a juridical context. Although the Tetragrammaton does not appear in this mythic psalm, numerous scholars have surmised that it has been removed to the editorial process by which the Elohistic Psalter, this is Psalms 42 to 83, was composed and has been replaced by Elohim in verses 1 and 8. In other words, in the original psalm, there was a reference here to the God of Israel. This is generally accepted by all interpreters, from traditional to critical interpreters, that the Elohim referred to in verses 1 and 8 is the God of Israel. According to this reading, the God of Israel stood as an accuser in the divine court, alleging that the other divine beings were guilty of judicial misconduct. Here I'll read a little bit of the psalm in English. A psalm of Asaph, God stands in the divine assembly. Among the divine being, he pronounces judgment. How long will you judge perversely, showing favor to the wicked? The psalm continues with a pronouncement directed against these divine beings that they will in fact perish like humans. It concludes with the address to Elohim in verse 8. Elohim here being the God of Israel. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit among the nations. The theological, cosmological picture of this psalm is not completely clear, and many scholars have debated whether this is a monotheistic psalm or not. All critical scholars have recognized here, once again in Psalm 82, the polytheistic background of this picture, although most understand that the author of the psalm has transformed this earlier myth by promoting the God of Israel to the head of the pantheon. Furthermore, this psalm, according to most people, most scholars, corrects the theological cosmological model posited in Deuteronomy 32, which had suggested that various B'nai Elohim have power and sovereignty over the nations. In this psalm, the God of Israel is able to take away their divinity and transform them into humans, thus subjugating these subordinate deities. They do not have independent authority that allows them to act upon their will. More recently, David Frankel, in an article, has suggested that Psalm 82 itself still reflects the earlier polytheistic conception, in which the God of Israel stands and accuses these divine beings within the divine court of El with a capital E, not a God, but the head God. This has been suggested before, even within the more circumscribed interpretive framework just outlined, since many commentators have suggested that the terms Adat El, which appears in verse 1, that God stands in the divine assembly, Adat El, and B'nai Elyon in verse 6, I have taken you for divine beings, sons of Elyon, sons of the Most High, preserve vestiges of such a polytheistic pantheon and court. However, Frankel extends this argument further and posits that verses 6 to 8 of the psalm are not the words of the God of Israel or the psalmist, but rather those of El, or Elyon, the head God. In his proposed reading, the psalm presumes a pantheon with El standing at its head. In light of the indictment that the God of Israel brings against the B'nai Elyon in El's court, it is El who decides to demote the B'nai Elyon to mere mortals, confiscating their lands and inheritance. And it is El who turns to the God of Israel in verse 8 and designates him to receive the inheritance of all the nations. This picture is in many ways a direct development of Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, according to the mythic option, featuring Elyon as the one who distributes the lands to the various Bnei Elohim. In a reversal of this original plan, the Most High God reappropriates these lands back from these divine beings and grants them to the God of Israel alone. Now, the second interpretation of Psalm 82, Frankel goes on to argue, finds its natural continuation in the Apocalypse of Daniel 7. As already noted above, Daniel 7 also describes a heavenly court scene in which a senior deity, the Ancient of Days, Atik Yomin, convicts subordinate divine characters, the four beasts, to death, while granting dominion over all nations of the world to a divine character of special status, the one like a man. The emphasis on sovereignty over the nations through Daniel 7, and in particular the use of the Aramaic root Hassan, suggests that this is the primary theme of the chapter of Daniel 7, as it is in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82. Moreover, if the ultimate message of the psalm is that the God of Israel is to inherit sovereignty over all the nations of the world, then the correspondence to the analysis of Daniel 7 above is even more striking. Of course, Frankel's interpretation of Psalm 82 needs to be further considered in order to assess whether it indeed bears out the position which he stakes out. The psalm is open to multiple interpretations, two of which were outlined briefly above, and others which were not addressed here at all. However, I would suggest that at the very least, we have an example here of inner biblical interpretation in which the author of the Apocalypse in Daniel 7 has read Psalm 82 in accordance with the interpretation outlined above. In the view of this apocalyptic author, the heavenly plane and its earthly parallel functioned according to the plan established at creation, but will both be transformed in the eschatological era when the sovereignty over the nations of the world will be bestowed upon the God of Israel in the divine court. Okay, that's all introduction to my arguments in the second half of the paper. But we're not finished. Just one or two more small points about Daniel 7. So that was the lighter part of the paper. Okay, now, the juridical context, or the context of the court, provides the background for the details of the heavenly scene in which the Ancient of Days is seated in verse 9. I promised that we're going to talk about a throne, so we have to look at the verse about the throne. So let's look back at verse 9 for a moment, which is in source 1 on page 1 of the handout. As I looked on, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garments were like white snow, and the hair of his head was like lamb's wool. His throne was tongues of flame, its wheels were blazing fire. In contrast to the title of my lecture, so here I have to correct the title of my lecture, verse 9 does not describe one throne, but karsevan, thrones, in plural, that were set in place. That's what the text says. There were thrones that were set up, not just one throne. This specific case of plural is frequently interpreted as equivalent to a dual form, two chairs. We'll see this later on in some of the sources. One for the Ancient of Days, and the other for one like a man. This interpretation, of course, has implications for the status of these divine figures, to which we will return below. But to my mind, it is much simpler to understand the plural thrones or chairs as a function of the heavenly court scene described in Daniel 7, which itself is based on the heavenly court scene in Psalm 82. In the latter, the character standing is the accuser in verse 1. Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, God is standing in the divine assembly. Or presumably, in its earliest context, God stands in the assembly of El. Now, whether the God of Israel serves as both the accuser and the judge, or merely as the accuser in the court of El, those were two different options, the picture there is of one divine actor who stands, leaving the rest of the agents in the divine assembly in Psalm 82 seated. The same scene is depicted in Daniel 7, and the Ancient of Days sits at the head of the court alongside all of the other divine beings. Now, the interpretation proposed here for Daniel 7 is at first glance striking in its theological assumption of the existence of a deity above the God of Israel, who is responsible. So stop. I said the wrong thing. Here's the part actually where I say it's not as problematic, but I went too far. Okay, now I'll read the sentence again. The interpretation proposed here for Daniel 7 is at first glance striking in its theological assumption of the existence of a deity above the God of Israel who is responsible for the distribution and redistribution of lands and empires. While this theological cosmological construct is familiar from an earlier context, going back to the ancient Near East, it is more surprising to find its expression in a passage which is generally dated, at least in its current form, to the 2nd century BCE. Simply expressed, is it conceivable that there were Jews in the 2nd century BCE who believed in the existence of a deity superior to the God of Israel? Now, as a methodological rule, such a priori arguments should be avoided, since we should not expect authors to conform to our assumptions about what they could or could not have believed or intended to express in a specific period of time. Rather, the text in question need to be analyzed and interpreted on their own terms, and only after we succeed in interpreting each work in its own framework of assumptions can we then continue to the next stage of assessing the place of the text in question within the larger literary, cultural, and ideational matrix from which it emerged. This is the only way to successfully avoid the potential pitfall of anachronistic scholarly assumptions and interpretations. At the same time, if the proposed interpretation leads to the conclusion that the passage in question is indeed unique in its worldview, and here I'll be more conservative in my claim, then caution must be exercised before positing a radical reading of the evidence. Due to the uniqueness of the worldview described here, at least in the 2nd century BCE, it is perhaps preferable to explain this hierarchy of deities not as the result of an exceptional theological perspective, in other words, that above the God of Israel there was another God, but rather due to the literary and exegetical dependence of the author of Daniel 7 upon the ancient myths of the division of the world as expressed in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82. The contours of the description of the eschatological period in this apocalypse are therefore not a direct description of this author's religious worldview, but instead a literary reflection of these foundational passages of biblical cosmogony, which were then further developed in Daniel 7's description of the eternal kingdom of the God of Israel. In other words, my claim is perhaps it's not such a radical perspective, and really he's using the biblical text that he has at his disposal, that are the foundational texts as the building blocks for building the apocalypse in Daniel 7. Following this line of thought, the author of Daniel 7 intended for his audience to identify and be aware of these familiar biblical passages and to understand the new composition against this religious and literary backdrop. The theological hierarchy is therefore not the primary point of this passage, but rather an echo of its mythical sources. The above identification of each of the divine characters in this heavenly drama, while perhaps precise on the literary level, is only part of the appropriate evaluation of the theological worldview of this apocalypse. A complete appreciation of the meaning of the apocalypse can only be obtained by reading it in light of the biblical sources which form its basis. Okay, so that's my analysis of Daniel 7. Okay. Now, I suggest that it is precisely this complex religious literary background of Daniel 7, which I'm proposing here, which led to the variety of readings of this scene that we encounter in early Jewish and Christian texts. Common to all readings of Daniel 7, both in and out of Daniel. When I say in Daniel, I mean Daniel 8 to 12, which I think these chapters are based on Daniel 7, is the demythologization of the heavenly scene in Daniel 7. In contrast to the mythological picture which I have sketched here this evening, according to which the God of Israel is represented by one like a man who is subordinate to the Ancient of Days, in all of the subsequent iterations of the story, the God of Israel has been promoted to the top position in the pantheon. Okay, and the moment that, once again, in my argument, if God is promoted, the God of Israel is promoted to the Ancient of Days in the readings of the text, so that leaves a vacuum for the identification of one like a man. And it is precisely this vacuum which leads, in all of the Jewish and early Jewish and Christian compositions which read this text, I think they all have the same cultural, they're all emerging from the same hermeneutic of reading Daniel 7. Let us begin with a passage from 1 Enoch. 1 Enoch is a composition that contains diverse materials from different time periods, ranging from the Book of Watchers, which is what we'll look at in the beginning, and the astronomical book that were composed in the 3rd century BCE, to the latest section, the Book of Similitudes or Parables, chapters 37 to 71, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture, which was probably composed in the 1st century CE, although it is difficult to date the latter with any precision. The date of the similitudes has been a running argument between scholars. Joseph Milik for many years claimed it was 3rd century CE and was a Christian work, but today amongst scholars of Second Temple Judaism, it's not really accepted. In other words, assumed it's a Jewish work from the 1st century CE. That's about the similitudes, but first we'll read from the Book of Watchers. 1 Enoch 14, which is from the Book of Watchers, contains a scene in which the protagonist, Enoch, as part of the tour of heavens, approaches the divine throne on behalf of the Watchers, the sinning angels, interceding for them to receive forgiveness. And I was reminded right before the lecture that I presented in Jerusalem, a lecture on sinning angels and on intercession in a previous event that was jointly sponsored. So apparently I keep on coming back to the same sources over and over again. Okay, so Enoch goes to God. He intercedes on their behalf to receive forgiveness. Now, although this chapter is not a courtroom scene in the strict sense of the term, it does describe God and his role as judge of heaven and earth and all of its inhabitants. The language of this passage, especially the description of the throne itself, is closely related to the vision in Daniel 7, as can be seen from the underlined expressions in the paragraph in source 8 on your handout. And I looked and saw therein a lofty throne. Its appearance was as crystal, and the wheels thereof as the shining sun. And there was the vision of the Kruvim. And from underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire. This is the vision, this is Daniel 7. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more than brightly, and the sun was whiter than any snow. If we look in verse 22, the flaming fire was round about him, and a great fire stood before him, and none could draw nigh him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, yet he needed no counselor. Okay, and you can read the rest of that source. Sorry, my pages are stuck together. Scholars have noted these close parallels and asserted that there is a literary relationship between the two passages, although, unfortunately, the original Aramaic version of Enoch has not survived for this chapter. So that would allow for a more precise comparison, where in this chapter we have both the Greek and Ethiopic text of Enoch. Both directions of literary dependence have been suggested. In other words, either Daniel is dependent on Enoch or Enoch is dependent on Daniel, although some scholars are of the opinion that there is not enough data in order to make this determination, allowing for other theoretical models of relationship, including a common source or traditions. Now, since this section of 1 Enoch is part of the Book of Watchers, which is generally dated to the 3rd century BCE, and since the second half of Daniel is dated to the second century BCE, I think most scholars assume that Daniel 7 is dependent on 1 Enoch. I didn't do a full count to see, but that's the general impression you get, that this is a potential source for Daniel 7. However, in light of the discussion above, I think we can and should assert the opposite direction of development. And I'm not the first person to say the opposite, but I think in light of the analysis above, it demonstrates this. Since the heavenly vision in 1 Enoch 14 presents a toned-down version of the mythological scene, according to which the Ancient of Days is clearly the one and only divine being. This monotheistic picture is almost certainly a religious development from the earlier, more polytheistic scheme that is found in Daniel 7, and which originated, as we said, in the Canaanite pantheon. In contrast to the multiple figures in the heavenly court in Daniel 7, which we identified with the Bnei Elohim as found in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, and the tens of thousands who served before, myriads of myriads, who served before him, 1 Enoch 14:23 explicitly asserts that he needed no counselor. From the perspective of the development of religious ideas, the most logical explanation to my mind, is that the picture of 1 Enoch 14 is part of a monotheistic corrective process, which eliminated the polytheistic elements present from the early stages of the tradition. Now, if this is the direction of development, and in light of the accepted date of each of these texts in their current form, then we must assume that Daniel 7 itself goes back to earlier texts and or traditions which preceded the Book of Watchers and 1st Enoch, because if I'm suggesting that 1st Enoch here is dependent on Daniel 7, so then I have to say that the vision in Daniel 7 itself goes back earlier than the 2nd century BCE. This is not particularly troubling since, as we have seen above, the mythological picture of Daniel 7 has early roots, which can be traced to earlier biblical passages and to extra-biblical sources. Moreover, since, as I noted above, it is somewhat surprising in a Jewish composition written in the 2nd century BCE to find this theologically problematic description of the heavenly court, it is actually helpful to conclude that in light of the comparison to 1 Enoch 14, that it suggests that it is in fact an earlier tradition that goes back before the 3rd century BCE. I can give additional arguments to demonstrate that Daniel 7 goes back to earlier traditions and texts, but that's it for this lecture. I mean, that's not the end of the lecture. That's it in terms of the argument about 1 Enoch 14. Okay, now, another composition related to the Book of Enoch is the work generally referred to as the Book of Giants. Okay, and this is in source number 9. This work was preserved at Qumran in fragmentary copies in its original Aramaic. But we have much later copies of this work, albeit in a different literary form, preserved and promulgated primarily by Manichaeans in diverse languages, including Syriac, Greek, Persian, Sogdian, and Arabic. In one of the Aramaic copies of this work from Qumran, 4Q 530, which is source number 9, this is one fragment from this scroll, we encounter language that is highly similar to the description of the divine throne in Daniel 7. And here we have the Aramaic text itself, so we can actually say this with some level of certainty that it's the same language. Look in line 17. And the thrones were arranged, and the great Holy One sat down. 100 hundreds served him, 1,000 thousands prostrated, all of them in front of him were standing, and behold, books were opened, and a judgment was pronounced. This passage, which details the dream of one of the giants from the story of the Watchers, shares significant Aramaic expressions with Daniel 7. Thrones which were set up, thousands who were standing before him, books opened, and the proclamation of a legal sentence. Here, too, scholars have debated the relationship between this text and Daniel and 1 Enoch 14. In many ways, this passage seems closer to Daniel 7 than what we observed above regarding 1 Enoch 14. Interestingly, in contrast to 1 Enoch 14, the passage from the Book of Giants shares with Daniel 7 the plural use of the thrones, karsivan. You have plural word thrones. Similarly, the legal context is explicit in the Book of Giants, including the heavenly books being opened before the divine judge. But these similarities, in fact, betray their origins when we analyze the text of Giants, the Book of Giants, on its own terms. In contrast to Daniel 7, there seems to be no discernible reason for multiple chairs or thrones in this dream about the heavenly realm. In other words, there are no other divine beings that are sitting down on these thrones. Furthermore, here too, similar to 1 Enoch 14, here I say it, what I just said. There are no additional heavenly characters beyond Kadisha Rabbah, the great holy one, who have a primary role in the scene. But if our analysis above of Daniel 7 is correct, then I suggest that it strongly suggests that Daniel 7 is the source of the imagery in the composition preserved in the Qumran scroll. In Daniel 7, each of the elements listed above can be traced back to its sources, and in particular Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, each of which describe a hierarchy of divine figures. In those contexts, and in particular in the courtroom drama of Psalm 82, the significance of the multiple thrones is immediately clear. However, the moment the other heavenly actors are no longer active agents, then the plural thrones becomes meaningless. In this sense, the number of thrones allows us to trace the typological development of the scene along its theological exegetical axis. The earliest scene is Daniel 7, which uses the plural thrones due to its polytheistic roots. This is followed by the Book of Giants, which retains the plural thrones, but has only one divine agent. And finally, 1 Enoch 14, in which the number of thrones has been corrected to match this monotheistic picture. Okay, so this proposed typological scheme is not intended to necessarily reflect a linear progression from one source to the other. So I'm not claiming that Book of Giants used Daniel 7 and 1 Enoch 14 used Book of Giants, but this is a typological claim. But rather to trace the general development of the growth of the traditions found in these related sources. Now, the presence of multiple thrones in Daniel 7 was a source of theological consternation for the rabbis, since they too read this chapter through monotheistic lenses. It is precisely this tension which stands at the basis of the exegetical arguments found in an oft-cited Braita quoted in Babylonian Talmud Tractate Chagiga 14a, folio 14a. Just one second. Thanks. One passage says, his throne was fiery flames. And another passage says, till thrones were placed and the Ancient of Days did sit. Okay, the two halves of verse 9, thank you. There is no, and so the question is, how do you justify one throne versus, in the beginning of the verse, multiple thrones at the end of the verse? There is no contradiction. One throne for him, in other words, for God, and one for David. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva. Said Rabbi Yosef the Galilean to him, Akiva, how long will thou treat the divine presence as profane? Now, another version that appears right after, there's a sentence, I omitted one sentence in the middle. One for justice and one for mercy. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva. In other words, a different opinion attributed to Rabbi Akiva. Said Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to him, Akiva, what hast thou to do with Agadah? Cease thy talk and turn to the laws concerning defilement through leprosy signs and tent covering. Rather, it must mean one for a throne and one for a stool. The throne to sit upon, the stool for a footrest. For it is said, the heaven is my throne and the earth is my footrest. The verse from Isaiah, the last chapter of Isaiah. These two variant versions of the discussion between Rabbi Akiva and his interlocutors revolves around the interpretive issue of the number of thrones in Daniel 7:9. On the one hand, the Ancient of Days is described as sitting on a single throne in the beginning of the verse, while multiple thrones are set up subsequently. Now, there are two assumptions at the heart of this question proposed in this Braita. First, that there's only one central divine figure in the scene in Daniel 7. And second, that the multiple form of thrones refers specifically to two thrones. In other words, that it's equivalent of a dual form. In the first solution attributed to Rabbi Akiva, the second throne is assigned for David. Some scholars, and here Daniel Boyarin has suggested this, have suggested that David here represents a messianic and even a heavenly messianic figure. But this is not what it says in the source. David here, this is in my reading. David here is the human David. It says he's David, who stands at the head of the Davidic monarchic line. The logic of this suggestion is based upon the bestowal of eternal dominion upon Baranash in Daniel 7, which translates in this exegesis to the Davidic royal line. The rather strong response by Rabbi Yosef the Galilean is based upon a perspective that does not allow for anyone, divine or human, to sit next to God in heaven. The second response offered by Rabbi Akiva, according to which the plural thrones refers to characteristics of God, justice and mercy, obviates the presence of any figure, human or divine. But this too is met with derision by his interlocutor, here's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who advises him to stay away from non-legal discussions, which are in his view beyond his expertise. It's very striking, especially if you read it in its original language. He says, stop dealing with Agadic passages, your expertise is in legal passages, and when you try to deal with these things, you see what happens. Even this response, both attributes in reference to God himself is considered beyond reason or beyond the pale for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, since, and here we learn from parallel sources, it opens the door to the notion of multiplicity within the divinity himself. The idea in Hebrew, shtei reshuyot, that you have more than one divine being, even within God himself. Instead, he suggested that the two thrones are both pieces of furniture used by God himself, the chair, the throne, and the footstool. Now, these interpretive options all go back to the anomaly created when the polytheistic picture at the root of Daniel 7 was reimagined in a monotheistic worldview. Out of the options noted here, only Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the first version retains Bar Enash as an actor in the heavenly drama, although he has been transformed into the human David, who stands at the head of the monarchic line. Now, due to the lack of time, I cannot address a rich array of rabbinic sources. I gave you one rabbinic source. This is a topic addressed in multiple rabbinic sources. And in addition, extensive traditions in Hechalot literature about Metatron. But I won't speak about those tonight. But I suggest, too, it's the same tension in the reading of Daniel 7 that continues. Now, the number of thrones is not the fundamental question here. Okay? The number of thrones is not the fundamental question. It's a symptom, not the cause. It's a rather symptomatic of the larger issue of the transformation of one theological cosmological scheme to another. Right? Daniel 7 presents one picture, and then it's in a few hundred years later, people are reading it differently. This issue is most pressing, of course, to the one like a man, Bar Enash, which is frequently translated hyperliterally as son of man. I said that above. As I claimed above, here I don't have to say what I claimed above. Okay. Let me skip. Now, already within Daniel itself, one can see that the angel Michael, I think that's the natural interpretation of Daniel 8 to 12, has assumed this role in Daniel 10 and 12. And this would be an interesting example of inner Danielic interpretation and development. But outside of Daniel, in early Jewish and Christian literature, other solutions were developed to fill this lacuna. In an article that I published, I think 2 years ago, in the journal Dead Sea Discoveries about a Qumran scroll entitled The Aramaic Daniel Apocalypse, 4Q 246, more popularly known as the Son of God text. It's a very popular text. A lot has been written on it, and I suggested a different interpretation there, which is actually an outgrowth of some of my claims here tonight, but that would be another lecture. I have argued against all scholars that the Son of God in that text is not Bar Enash of Daniel 7, but rather the heavenly representatives of the other empires, as in Psalm 82. But here the more important point is, it seems to me that in that scroll, this Qumran scroll, the character of Bar Enash has been eliminated from the scene entirely. Okay, it's very similar to 1 Enoch 14. We don't have a character as Bar Enash anymore. In other words, one way to solve the problem of this vacuum is to erase it. Now, in the last source, which is a very long source, the similitudes of Enoch, which is Enoch 37 to 71, which, as I mentioned above, is considered by everyone to be the latest section of Enoch from the 1st century CE, we find frequent references to the Son of Man, who can clearly be traced back to Daniel 7. And here you can look in chapter 46. There I saw one who had a head of days. That's Atikyomin, ancient of days. And his head was like white wool. And with him was another whose face was like the appearance of a man. And you can see in verse 2 again, and I asked the angel of peace who went with me and showed me all the hidden things about that Son of Man. And verse 3, and he answered me and said to me, this is the Son of Man, who has righteousness, and righteousness dwells with him. How much time do I have left? Or
7 minutes.
7 minutes. No, it's good. So I'm just debating how much to read the sources and how much to, I think I'll just talk about the sources and let you, if you want, read them as I'm talking, or take them home and enjoy tonight reading the similitudes. Okay, so first I'll speak about sources A and B. These descriptions in sources A and B, so from chapters 46 and 69, are based directly upon the picture in Daniel 7, involving an elderly ancient of days, Atikyomin, and a son of man. And here they translate son of man. This is a very literal translation. This is the translation of basically Nicolsburg's translation from his commentary in a separate volume that he put out. And he translates it, the Bar Enash was translated from Aramaic to Greek to Ethiopic. And this is based on the Ethiopic text, which also has son of man. In other words, it's the same Semitic construction. This role assigned to the Son of Man here is broader than Daniel 7, and he not only receives dominion from the Ancient of Days, but is also responsible for the bestowal and removal of this authority from others as well. In addition, he has the role of the punishment of the sinners. Now, I suggest that all of these elements in these two sources are probably borrowed from the judicial context of Daniel 7, but here the powers have been transferred, the powers of punishing the sinners have been transferred from the Ancient of Days to Bar Enash. Now, the Son of Man is eternal, according to the similitudes, and was in existence prior to creation, as we see in source C, chapter 48, which is reminiscent of early traditions surrounding wisdom, from the book of Proverbs, for example. So chapter 48, verses 2 and 3. And in that hour the Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of spirits, in his name before the head of days. Even before the sun and the constellations were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of spirits. The Son of Man in these passages is clearly a heavenly character who sits beside the Ancient of Days, Lord of Spirit, or Lord of Spirits, those are the interchangeable, and is even the object of worship and veneration. If we look in chapter 48, the continuation of the passage, he will be a staff for the righteous, that they may lean on him and not fall. He will be a light of the nations, and it will be a hope for those who grieve in their hearts. All who dwell on the earth will fall down and worship before him, and they will glorify and bless and sing hymns to the name of the Lord of Spirits. For this reason he was chosen and hidden in his presence before the world was created and forever. And the wisdom of the Lord of Spirits has revealed to him, to the holy and righteous, for he has preserved the lot of the righteous. The picture of the Son of Man and similitudes deserves a more extensive treatment, which I'm unable to pursue due to time constraints, because now I'm down to 4 minutes. However, I want to finish this section with a controversial passage from the end of the similitudes, which has generated much scholarly discussion, namely the identity of the Son of Man. Until the final passage of the similitudes, so from chapter 37 until 71, the composition seems to be referring to a heavenly being responsible for both reward and punishment, but this being is left anonymous. This changes dramatically in the final verses of this section, and the radical shift has led many scholars, and I would say even maybe the majority view of scholars, to consider this passage a later interpolation. And the head of days, chapter 71, verse 13, came with Michael and Raphael and Gabriel and Phanuel and thousands and tens of thousands of angels without number. And he came to me here is Enoch, and greeted me with his voice and said to me, "You are that Son of Man, who was born for righteousness, and righteousness dwells on you, and the righteousness of the head of days will not forsake you." Here, there's a clear identification of Enoch, the protagonist throughout the book, as Son of Man. What is not clear, and here this is the debate, is whether this refers to him by a title, Son of Man, which would be significant as an early Jewish source that perhaps describes the elevation of a human to heavenly status, or a Son of Man, meaning a human being. And a lot has been written about this. Books, entire conferences have been dealt with these verses. I say that now. Entire volumes have been dedicated to this interpretive question, and here too one should remember that even in the biblical source, the early biblical character of Enoch, as described in Genesis 5, and in early Enochic literature, was unique in that he was elevated to heaven. At the same time, this passage offers an important parallel to the identification of Jesus as the Son of Man in the Gospels, which is why I think this passage has really attracted all the attention that it has. Now, I want to conclude with just a few sentences about the New Testament Son of Man question, which is really beyond the scope of this lecture. Now, I do not intend to start reviewing New Testament passages that refer to Jesus as the Son of Man, and they are presumably well known to many people in this audience. This has been done by many scholars before me, some of them in the city of Rome. What I want to suggest is that the interpretation of the Son of Man as Jesus is part of the same religio-interpretive process described above, in which a polytheistic pantheon in Daniel 7 was reread with the God of Israel promoted to the position of the Ancient of Days. Some Jewish sources reinterpreted the Son of Man as Michael or Enoch, or even felt the need to eliminate this enigmatic character altogether. But I suggest that this is the same cosmological, theological, and exegetical background of the New Testament authors who applied similar methods leading to the identification, hermeneutical methods, leading to the identification of the one like Bar Enash with Jesus. This fundamental notion in early Christianity goes hand in hand with the matrix of beliefs and ideas of early Judaism, and they must be evaluated together in order to understand the common religious world from which they emerged. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Segal, for taking us along in this fascinating journey into the depths of some details of the book of Daniel and its parallels. As Professor Segal stayed within the given 7 minutes, we do indeed have now 15 minutes for our discussion here. And as I know of the significant number of biblical scholars in this room, I am confident that some are dying to enter into dialogue with Professor Segal on some of the assumptions of this lecture. So there will be a microphone giving around if you just raise your hand to give a sign where the microphone should arrive. Jean-Pierre.
So many thanks for this fascinating presentation. I noticed that in Daniel 7, the relationship between the two beings, heavenly beings, is not in space. It's not El Elyon, the Most High, and the minor or the inferior divinity, but it's in time, a temporal relationship. Atik Hayamim, the Ancient of Days, and Bar-Enash, Bar, Ben, the one who comes after. Mm-hmm. So does it have any relevance? Is it a way to soften the clash?
It's interesting. I didn't think about that at all. And so, in other words, you're suggesting that in this picture, I'm not sure if it softens it or emphasizes the problem. Because according to, if I understand your interpretation correctly, you're saying there's already a dualistic notion in this picture of two equal divine beings, one older and one younger, but they are on equal footing. So first of all, I don't, as I said, my first reaction is I'm not sure if that helps. In other words, it'd be interesting. It's interesting pursuing it, but theologically, I think it would be equally troubling. Equally troubling, but that's not a concern in this case. I do think, though, the picture here of the I didn't bring all of the Canaanite sources on the handout. We have other sources from the Baal epic, which talk about El as describing him as an old man. So, which strengthens the connection to Daniel 7 even more. And in the context, once again, if you buy the argument, which I of course do, that this goes back to that picture, at least in the Canaanite pantheon, it's very clear that El is above Baal. And the older and the younger reflect, as in many parts of life, reflect a hierarchy of who's in charge and who's second in command. So.
Professor Williamson.
Somewhat in the same territory, I was slightly puzzled right at the start, or in the first part of your lecture, where you were drawing parallels between the doxologies at the end of some of the stories and what is said in Daniel 7. But there is surely one significant distinction, and that is that in all the doxologies, dominion and so on are inherently the Lord's or God's, whereas in the case in Daniel 7, it's Yehivle, it's given to him. So they're not on a par. It looks to me as, again, you've got two different characters here. One who inherently has dominion, and someone then to whom it is given. And I didn't hear you draw that distinction out.
Okay, so thank you very much for that distinction. I did not draw that distinction. So you're correct that I did not draw it. The reason why, at least in my reading of Daniel 7, it is the picture is not of the Ancient of Days of Atik Yomin having dominion throughout. Dominion has already been given to the other lower divine beings earlier on, and it's at least in my understanding of this picture, and then it is taken away and given to Bar-Enash. In other words, it's not that Atik Yomin is holding on to this and then he suddenly gives it to Bar-Enash, but there are heavenly characters, heavenly actors who have the dominion, which is then taken away and given and transferred to another being. Now, theoretically, you could claim, which is, I follow your argument, that Atik Yomin has, since he is able to reappropriate and redistribute appropriate and redistribute, then that is what's referred to in the doxologies. I tried to sort of couple together the two arguments, the coming on the cloud and that, and here I'll throw in also in the, which I didn't go into here, comparison with Ezekiel chapter 1, where there too the God of Israel is described as a man. Emerton actually, that's what I thought you were going to ask actually. Emerton already in his, I think it was in the IOSOT, I don't know which one, but he already noted a lot of these parallels. He didn't push it as far as I'm pushing it. More recently, Daniel Boyarin pushed it a little farther than I'm pushing it. And that's where I think our readings would differ.
With this, we have come to the conclusion of the academic part of our event tonight. Please consider staying with us for a little longer. There's snacks and drinks served outside. Look out for the kosher section. I know from previous years that this is the one you prefer. Thank you very much for being with us here tonight. Thanks for your coming. Stay faithful to the activities of the Cardinal Beer Center. Look at the website of what's going on. I use the opportunity to point out that there will be a concert. It's the first time a concert that has been delayed for several times. It will happen eventually on January 19th of 2017. Thank you very much.